The afternoon sun poured through the massive windows of the Grand Alexander Hotel, painting everything in a warm, expensive-looking gold. The air smelled like polished wood, fancy flowers, and quiet money. People sat in deep, plush armchairs, the gentle clink of teacups against saucers making a soft music of its own. A low, smooth melody played from hidden speakers, just enough to fill the comfortable silence. Everyone here looked like they belonged. The men wore crisp suits. The women had elegant dresses and calm smiles. They spoke in low voices about business, or travel, or which new restaurant was impossible to get into. It was a world wrapped in velvet, moving at a slow, graceful pace. Then, the main glass doors slid open with a quiet whoosh, and a different kind of air seemed to walk in. A young girl, maybe 16 or 17, stepped into the lobby. She moved carefully, as if the shiny marble floor might be slippery. Her dark hair was pulled back into a simple, slightly messy ponytail. Her blue jacket was faded at the elbows, and her jeans had a small, neat patch on one knee. Her sneakers, once white, were now a soft gray from countless steps. On her back was a worn, dark green backpack, stuffed full and looking heavy. She stood just inside the doorway for a moment, her eyes wide, taking in the towering ceilings and the glittering chandeliers. She didn't look scared exactly, more like she was looking for one specific thing in all that grandeur. Her gaze swept past the gleaming front desk, over the groups of chatting guests, and then it stopped. It landed on the piano. It sat in the center of the lobby like a king on a throne. A grand piano, so black and shiny it looked like a pool of still, dark water. The golden letters above the keys spelled Steinway and Sons. The afternoon sun caught its curves, making it glow. To the girl, it was the most beautiful thing in the room. She began to walk towards it, her sneakers making almost no sound on the marble. Her path took her past a table where two women were having tea. One of the women, wearing a pearl necklace, noticed her. The woman's eyes moved slowly, from the girl's scuffed shoes, up her old jeans, to her simple jacket. A tiny, almost invisible frown appeared on the woman's perfectly made-up face. She leaned over to her friend and whispered something behind her hand. Her friend glanced over, her expression turning cool and dismissive. They both turned back to their tea, a clear message that the girl was not worth their attention, but the girl didn't see them. All she saw was the piano. She felt a pull towards it, like a magnet. As she got closer, she could see the perfect, clean reflection of the lobby lights in its polished surface. Her heart beat a little faster in her chest. Without really thinking, drawn by a force stronger than her shyness, she reached out her hand. Her fingers, which were clean but had short, practical nails, were just about to gently touch the beautiful, dark wood of the piano's lid. "Excuse me." The voice was sharp, loud, and it cut through the peaceful lobby air like a knife. It came from a man in a tailored suit standing behind the concierge desk. His name tag said, Mr. Pembroke. He had been watching the girl since she walked in, his face a mask of polite disapproval that was now cracking. The girl snatched her hand back, clutching it to her chest as if burned. Mr. Pembroke walked around his desk, his shoes tapping a firm, official rhythm on the floor. He stopped a few feet from her, looking down his nose. "That," he said, making sure his voice carried, "is not for touching." A few other guests looked up from their books and phones. A businessman paused his conversation. The two women with the teacups watched with renewed, amused interest. The girl's cheeks flushed a warm pink. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice so soft it was almost lost in the big room. "This instrument is very valuable," Mr. Pembroke continued, speaking more to the watching guests than to her. "It is for display and for scheduled performances by professional artists only." He said the word professional with extra weight, making it clear which category this bedraggled visitor fell into. He gestured vaguely towards her clothes. "The hotel lobby is for guests. Are you a guest here?" She shook her head, looking down at her shoes. "I didn't think so," Mr. Pembroke said, a note of triumph in his voice. He had solved the problem. "Then I must ask you to move along. You are disturbing the atmosphere." A young bellhop, leaning against a luggage cart, tried to hide a smirk. One of the tea-drinking women let out a small, unkind laugh, quickly covered by a sip from her cup. The girl could feel all their eyes on her, the looks that said she was dirty, that she was a nuisance, that she had wandered into a place where she had no right to be. For a moment, she just stood there, shrinking under their stares. She looked from Mr. Pembroke's stern face to the beautiful, forbidden piano. A storm of feelings fought inside her, shame, anger, and a deep, aching sadness. The piano wasn't just a fancy object to her. It was a memory. It was a connection to a person she missed more than anything in the world. That connection felt stronger than her fear. She took a small, shaky breath and lifted her head. She looked Mr. Pembroke right in the eye. Her voice, when it came out, was still quiet, but it didn't waver this time. "Please," she said. The single word hung in the air. Just one piece. The word "please" seemed to hang in the air of the grand lobby, small and fragile against the towering silence. For a second, no one moved. The two women at the tea table had stopped pretending to sip. They were openly staring now, their faces a mix of shock and curiosity. How dare she? Their expressions seemed to say. The businessman had put his phone down completely, his briefcase forgotten at his feet. Even the soft, piped-in music felt like it had paused, waiting to see what would happen next. Mr. Pembroke, the concierge, was the most stunned of all. His carefully practiced mask of polite authority slipped completely. He hadn't expected a reply. He had expected the girl to mumble another apology, tuck her head down, and scurry back out the big glass doors. That was how these situations were supposed to go. This quiet, stubborn please was a wrench thrown into the smooth machinery of his day. He blinked, his mind racing. He could simply call security. That would be the easiest thing. 2 taps on his radio and a large, polite man in a uniform would escort her out. But something stopped him. The eyes of the guests were on him now, too. He had made a public scene of it. If he just threw her out, he would look like a bully, crushing a harmless, strange request. He needed to win this, and win it in a way that made him look in control. A new idea began to form in his mind. A cruel one, dressed up as fairness. His lips, which had been pressed into a thin line, slowly curved into a tight, humorless smile. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who believes he has just checkmated his opponent. "One piece?" He repeated, his voice louder now, projecting to the small audience that had gathered. He took a small step closer to the girl, looking down at her. "You understand this is a concert instrument? A Steinway?" He said the name slowly, as if teaching a child. "It is not a public keyboard in a train station." A faint, snorting laugh came from the direction of the bellhop. The girl didn't flinch this time. She just kept looking at Mr. Pembroke, her dark eyes serious and unwavering. This only annoyed him more. "Fine," he said, spreading his hands in a grand theatrical gesture. "You want to play so badly? Let's have a little demonstration." He paused, letting the word demonstration sink in. He was turning her request into a performance, a test. "You may play one piece. Right now. For all of us." He gestured to the small crowd of guests, who were now watching this unfold like a play. The woman with the pearls had a faint, expectant smile. This was better than afternoon tea. "If," Mr. Pembroke continued, his voice dropping to a condescending tone, you can play something recognizable, something that shows you have a right to touch these keys. Then you may stay for a while. You can even finish your piece." He made it sound like a great, generous gift. Then his expression hardened. The false smile vanished. "But if you cannot, if you hit a few wrong notes and make a noise that disturbs our guests," he leaned in slightly, "then you will leave immediately, and you will not come back. Do we have an agreement?" He held out his hand, not to shake hers, but to point toward the piano bench, like a judge pronouncing a sentence. The challenge was clear. He was giving her enough rope to hang herself. In his mind, the outcome was certain. This girl, with her worn clothes and quiet voice, was about to humiliate herself. She would tap out a clumsy, childish tune like Chopsticks or fumble through the first few bars of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and that would be that. The guests would have a funny story to tell. He would have defended the dignity of the hotel, and the problem would be solved. He was already picturing the look of embarrassed defeat on her face. The air in the lobby grew thick. All the gentle sounds, the clink of china, the rustle of a newspaper, had completely stopped. Every single person was focused on the girl in the faded blue jacket. The pressure was a physical thing. It was coming from Mr. Pembroke's smug stare, from the bored curiosity of the wealthy guests, from the bellhop's mocking grin. The girl stood very still. She looked from Mr. Pembroke's pointing finger to the majestic, silent piano. The shiny black surface seemed to look back at her, waiting. For a long moment, she said nothing. The guests began to shift in their seats. Was she going to run? Was she finally realizing how foolish this was? Then she moved. It was a simple movement. She slowly, carefully, slid the heavy green backpack off her shoulders. It made a soft thump as she placed it on the deep, luxurious carpet by her feet. She didn't look at the people anymore. She didn't look at Mr. Pembroke. Her whole world seemed to shrink down to the space. Between her and the piano, she took one step forward, then another. Her steps were slow, but they were not the steps of someone who was scared. They were the steps of someone walking towards something they had to do. She reached the velvet-covered piano bench. For a second, she just stood beside it, her hand resting lightly on its edge. She took a deep, slow breath, her shoulders rising and then falling. It was the breath of a diver about to plunge into deep water. And she sat down. The bench was high. For a moment, her feet didn't quite touch the floor. She adjusted herself slightly, her back straightening. She pushed a stray strand of hair behind her ear. The transformation was subtle, but startling. The slouching, hesitant girl was gone. In her place sat someone with a quiet, focused posture. She extended her hands over the keys, but didn't touch them yet. She just let them hover there, as if warming them by the instrument's presence. Mr. Pembroke crossed his arms over his chest, his smile returning. He glanced at the tea ladies, sharing a look that said, "Watch this." He was waiting for the first clumsy, crashing chord. The girl closed her eyes. The last bit of noise in the lobby, a cough, a whisper, died away. The only sound was the distant hum of the city outside. In that absolute quiet, she lowered her hands. The silence in the lobby was so complete, it felt like a held breath. The girl's fingers, which had been hovering just above the pale ivory keys, finally descended. But there was no crash, no clumsy, childish bang. Instead, she pressed down a single note with her left hand. It was a low note, deep and soft. A G. It wasn't played loudly, but in that perfect quiet, it seemed to vibrate through the very floor. The sound didn't fade quickly. It hung in the air, rich and round, like a stone dropped into a still pond. The ripples moving out to touch everyone in the room. That one note changed everything. The smirk on Mr. Pembroke's face didn't vanish all at once. It first just froze. His eyes, which had been narrowed with expectation, widened just a fraction. This wasn't the sound of someone who didn't know what they were doing. This was the sound of control, of intent. Before that first note could completely fade, the girl's right hand joined. Not with a melody, but with a chord. A complex, haunting set of notes that wrapped around that deep G like a shadow. It was a sad sound, beautiful, but filled with a deep, aching question. Then her left hand moved again, a slow, walking pattern of bass notes that felt like a heavy heart beating. A polite, piped-in music that usually filled the lobby was now a distant, forgotten memory. This was real. This was alive. The air itself seemed to crackle with it. The two women at the tea table were no longer leaning back in their chairs. They were sitting bolt upright, their spoons forgotten in their cups. The woman with the pearl necklace had her hand pressed lightly to her chest, her mouth slightly open. The look of bored amusement was gone, wiped clean from her face. It was replaced by pure, unguarded surprise. The businessman had stopped looking at his watch. He was staring at the girl's back, at the focused curve of her shoulders. He knew a little about music. He had been to concerts. This was not someone pretending. The way her hands were shaped over the keys, curved and relaxed, was the way a professional's hands looked. The young bellhop was no longer smirking. He was just staring, his arms limp at his sides. He didn't understand the music, but he understood feeling. And what he was feeling was a shiver going right up his spine. The girl herself seemed to have disappeared into another world. Her eyes were still closed. She wasn't playing for the concierge or the guests or to win a challenge. Her head tilted slightly, following the flow of the music only she could hear in her mind first. A small, painful frown touched her brow for a second, then smoothed away as her hands began to move with more purpose. The music began to tell a story. It started quietly, sadly, like someone remembering a lost, happy time. The melody that emerged from her right hand was simple and sweet, but the left hand underneath, it was a storm cloud gathering, playing low, rumbling notes that spoke of trouble coming. Her fingers weren't just hitting keys. They were dancing. They leaped from the low, dark end of the piano to the high, tinkling notes and back again, never missing, never stumbling. Then the storm broke. The music exploded. It wasn't noise. It was a powerful, rushing wave of sound. Her left hand became a roaring waterfall of deep notes, while the right hand flew across the keys in a frantic, dazzling run. It was fierce and passionate, and full of an anger so strong it made the businessman grip the arms of his chair. The tea in the delicate cups on the table near the piano shivered with the vibration. Mr. Pembroke had uncrossed his arms. His hands hung at his sides, fingers twitching nervously. The color had drained from his face. He looked from the girl to the guests, seeing their captivated expressions, and a cold dread began to pool in his stomach. He had been so wrong. This wasn't a street kid messing around. This was a musician, a real one. He had tried to make a fool of her, and instead, he had given her a stage. The weight of his mistake settled on him, heavy and sickening. As quickly as the storm had come, it passed. The girl's hands slowed. The music softened, becoming fragile and tender again. It was even sadder now, because you could still hear the echo of the storm in it. She played a series of high, crystal-clear notes that fell like tears. Then, with a movement that was both firm and gentle, she brought the phrase to a close with two deep, solemn chords. There was a pause. A space of maybe 2 seconds where the last note hummed in the strings of the great piano and in the hearts of the listeners. And then, without opening her eyes, she began the next section. She wasn't done. She had only just begun. The guests, who had maybe thought the show was over, realized they were in the middle of a journey. No one moved. No one coughed. The world outside the hotel's windows, the cars, the people, the city noise had ceased to exist. The only thing that was real was the girl on the bench and the world of emotion she was pulling from the beautiful. Black piano. Mr. Pembroke slowly, weakly, leaned back against his concierge desk, as if his legs could no longer hold him up. He had asked for a demonstration. He was getting a master class, and he had never felt smaller in his entire life. The girl was no longer in the hotel lobby. That's what it felt like to everyone watching. Her body was there, sure, sitting straight on the velvet bench, her hands flying and dancing over the keys. But the person, the spirit inside, was somewhere else entirely. She was in the memory the music was painting. Her face, which had been so still and cautious before, was now alive with feeling. A sharp pain would flicker across her forehead during a fierce, crashing chord. A deep sadness would soften her eyes in the quiet, singing parts. Sometimes, for just a second when the melody soared, there was a glimpse of something like joy, a ghost of a smile that was gone before it fully formed. The piece was a roller coaster none of them had been ready for. It would build and build, getting faster and louder, until it felt like the very walls of the grand lobby might shake. Her fingers were a blur during these parts, moving with a speed that seemed impossible. The businessman, who had once glanced at his watch, now couldn't have told you what time it was if you'd asked. He was leaning forward, elbows on his knees, completely captured. He'd heard music like this in concert halls, from men in tuxedos and women in sparkling gowns. Never from a teenager in a worn jacket in a quiet afternoon lobby. The two women at the tea table had forgotten they were holding cups. One had a napkin clutched tightly in her hand, and she didn't even realize a single tear had escaped and rolled down her powdered cheek. The music was touching a place words couldn't reach. It was speaking of loss, of love, of a fight against something huge. The woman with the pearls felt a sudden, sharp shame for her earlier whisper. She had judged a book by its cover, and the story inside was breaking her heart. A hotel guest who had been walking down the marble staircase stopped halfway. He just sat down on the steps, resting his chin in his hands, and listened. A maid pushing a cleaning cart had quietly wheeled it to the edge of the room and stood still. Her hands folded in front of her. The piano itself seemed like a different instrument. Before, it had been a beautiful statue, a piece of furniture. Now it was a living thing. It growled under the girl's left hand during the dark, thunderous passages. It sang like a human voice when she played the lonely, beautiful melody. It sparkled like sunlight on water during the fleeting, hopeful runs up high. She was talking to it, and it was answering her with every note. Mr. Pembroke, the concierge, felt like he was made of stone. He couldn't move from his spot, leaning against the desk. The cold dread in his stomach had turned into a deep, aching hollow. He kept thinking of his own words. If you can play something recognizable, this was one of the most famous pieces of piano music ever written. He realized that now. He just didn't know its name. He thought of his smirk, his grand gesture giving her permission to fail. He wanted to shrink, to disappear into the polished wood of his desk. Every beautiful note felt like a tiny, sharp pinprick on his skin, reminding him of his mistake. The music was climbing again. It was building towards something huge. The girl's body tensed, gathering all its energy. Her foot, which had been gently working the soft pedal, now pressed down on the other one, the sustain pedal, letting all the sounds bleed together into a great roaring wave. She attacked the keys, not with anger, but with a powerful, desperate passion. It was the sound of a struggle, of someone trying to climb out of a deep, dark hole. The chords were massive, complex, crashing one after another like ocean waves against a cliff. And then, at the very peak of this storm, something incredible happened. The girl, for the first time since she started, opened her eyes. They weren't looking at the keys. They were focused on something far away, straight ahead, and they were shining with unshed tears. In that moment, she wasn't a mysterious prodigy. She was just a girl, heartbroken and brave, pouring everything she had into the music. She held that final, thunderous chord, her whole body rigid with the effort. And then, silence. A sudden, total, breathtaking silence. It was louder than the music had been. It rang in everyone's ears. Her hands fell from the keys and landed softly in her lap. Her shoulders slumped, all the fierce energy leaving her in one quiet sigh. She was back. The storm was over. For a long moment, nobody made a sound. The guest on the stairs didn't get up. The maid didn't move for her cart. The businessman just let out a long, slow breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Then, a single sound broke the spell. Clap. It was one solitary clap. It came from the well-dressed man who had been sitting alone in a corner armchair, reading a newspaper when the girl first walked in. He had lowered his paper during the first note and had not moved a muscle since. Now he slowly, deliberately, brought his hands together once. The sound was sharp and clear in the quiet room. It was like a starting pistol. Suddenly, the entire lobby erupted. The businessman stood up, clapping firmly. The two women at the tea table were on their feet, their earlier elegance replaced by genuine, emotional applause. The guest on the stairs stood and clapped. The bellhop, his face full of awe, joined in. Even the other hotel staff, who had gathered in the doorways of the back offices, were applauding. It wasn't wild, cheering applause. It was deeper than that. It was respectful, amazed, and full of the emotion the music had stirred in them. The girl on the bench seemed startled by the noise, as if she'd forgotten there were other people in the world. She blinked, the faraway look in her eyes clearing. A faint pink color returned to her cheeks. She looked down at her hands in her lap, then slowly, hesitantly, turned her head to look at the people standing and clapping for her. She didn't smile. She just looked, overwhelmed, and very, very tired. The performance had taken everything out of her. As the applause continued to fill the grand golden space of the lobby, she simply sat there, a small figure in the middle of the sound, the weight of her own music still hanging on her slender shoulders. The applause didn't stop. It went on, filling the huge lobby with a warm, roaring sound that was so different from the beautiful, sad piano music. People were standing, their faces soft and amazed. They were looking at the girl, not with pity or judgment anymore, but with something close to wonder. The girl on the piano bench seemed almost confused by the noise. She blinked a few times, coming back to herself. She looked at her hands in her lap, then slowly turned to see all the people clapping. A shy, unsure look crossed her face. She didn't bow or smile. She just gave a small, quick nod, her eyes glancing down again. It was as if the applause was for someone else, not for her in her faded blue jacket. She moved to stand up, her movements a little stiff, like she had been sitting for a very long time. But before she could, someone was walking towards her. It was the well-dressed man who had given the first clap. He was older, with kind eyes and gray hair at his temples. He wasn't clapping anymore. He walked right up to the piano, ignoring everyone else. "Please," he said, his voice quiet but clear. He held up a hand gently, asking her to stay seated for a moment. That was one of the most honest performances of Chopin I have ever heard. The girl looked up at him, her eyes wide. The man continued, a small, respectful smile on his face. "You didn't just play the notes. You told the story. That is a rare gift." He paused, then asked softly, "Where did you learn to play like that? Who is your teacher?" The question seemed to hit the girl in a deep place. The distant look from when she was playing came back into her eyes, but now it was filled with a raw, fresh sadness. She swallowed hard, looking down at the piano keys she had just brought to life. "My mother," she said, and her voice was a fragile whisper. She had to clear her throat to find it again. "She taught me. Since I was little." She reached out one finger and lightly, tenderly, touched a single key, not pressing it down. She was a pianist. A real one. She played in concerts. The girl took a shaky breath, gathering the strength to say the next part. "She played this piano. Right here. Years ago, when she was just starting. She told me the story so many times. About how nervous she was, and how the manager let her practice here in the mornings before the guests came down. She looked around the grand lobby, seeing it with new eyes, her mother's eyes. She said it was the most beautiful piano she had ever touched." The kind man's face grew very solemn. He understood now. "Your mother," he said gently. "She must be incredibly proud of you." The girl's chin trembled. She shook her head slowly, just once. She looked directly at the man, and a single tear finally escaped, tracing a clean line down her cheek. "She passed away last month." A soft, collective gasp seemed to move through the small crowd. The woman with the pearls brought her hand to her mouth. The businessman looked down at the floor, his jaw tight. The bellhop turned away, blinking hard. The girl wiped the tear away quickly, almost angrily. I wanted to see it. The piano she loved. I wanted to." She struggled for the words, her voice breaking. "I wanted to feel close to her again, to play for her one more time." That was her favorite piece. The truth settled over the lobby, heavier and more profound than any note she had played. This wasn't a show-off. This wasn't a stunt. This was a daughter's love letter, played on the only instrument that felt right. Mr. Pembroke, the concierge, had been standing frozen by his desk this whole time. The shame he felt was so hot and thick he could barely breathe. He had seen a dirty, troublesome kid. He had seen a problem to be removed. He had been cruel when she was grieving. He had made a challenge out of her deepest, most private moment. He forced his legs to move. He walked toward the piano, his steps slow and heavy. Everyone watched him. He stopped a few feet from the girl. All his official posture, his proud authority, was gone. He just looked like a tired, sorry man. He didn't know what to do with his hands. He finally clasped them in front of him. He looked at the girl, then down at his own shiny shoes. He began, but his voice cracked. He tried again. "I am so very sorry." The words were simple, but they were real. "I was wrong. I judged you poorly. I am deeply sorry for your loss." The girl looked at him. She didn't nod or accept his apology. She just looked. And in her look, there was a quiet understanding. She had gotten what she came for. His apology couldn't touch the hole in her heart, but she heard it. Then another person came forward. It was a woman in a sharp, dark suit, the hotel manager. She had been called by a staff member and had arrived in time to hear the end of the music and the girl's story. Her face was professional, but her eyes were warm and glistening. She came and stood beside the older gentleman. She looked at the girl, and then she did something unexpected. She gave a small, respectful bow of her head. "On behalf of the Grand Alexander," she said, her voice strong and clear, "thank you for that beautiful tribute to your mother. She must have been a remarkable woman." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "This piano? It is meant to make music like you made today. It should not sit silent." The manager looked from the girl to Mr. Pembroke, and then to the guests who were still listening, captivated by this real-life drama. "I would like to offer you an invitation," she said to the girl. An open invitation. Whenever you would like to come and play this piano, to remember your mother, our doors are open to you. No questions asked. You will always be welcome here. It was more than just permission. It was an honor. It was the hotel saying, you belong here with this instrument. The girl was silent for a long moment. She looked at the manager, at the kind man, at the piano. She slowly stood up from the bench. She picked up her worn green backpack from the floor and slung it over one shoulder. She looked small again, but different. The weight she carried seemed visible, but so did a new, quiet strength. The storm inside her had been let out through her fingers, and now there was a calm, even in the sadness. Thank you, she said softly, to the manager, to the room. Then she turned and walked slowly back across the marble floor. The same way she had come in. No one stopped her. No one said another word. They just watched her go, the echoes of her music still whispering in the air. The two women at the tea table sat back down, but they didn't speak. The businessman finally picked up his briefcase, but he didn't look at his phone. Mr. Pembroke walked back behind his desk, his head low. He would do his job differently from now on. The girl pushed through the big glass doors and stepped back out into the afternoon sun of the city. The sounds of traffic and people rushed in to fill the space where the music had been. She walked away, not as a stranger who didn't belong, but as the girl who had come to a grand hotel and for a few minutes made it a cathedral for a memory. She had come for a ghost and left behind a legend. And the great black piano waited, knowing it had been loved by two remarkable women, a generation apart.